Let's go straight to New York City, to my favorite American commentator, broadcaster, writer, and political activist, Caleb Maupin. Caleb, welcome back on the mother of all talk shows. Let me ask you about some breaking news. I don't know if you have heard it, but the president had a 1-hour conversation with the governor of Georgia, who recorded it and has now given it to the Washington Post, and we're expecting headlines in the morning. Did you catch that story?
Well, I did catch that Donald Trump is talking to swing states around the country and their legislatures about overturning the election results. That he basically is arguing that if swing states can decertify their electoral votes, that somehow this could be a last-ditch effort to overturn Biden's electoral victory. So the fact that he was on the phone with the governor of Georgia is certainly not surprising, and it'll be quite interesting to see, or rather to hear, what was said in that conversation, as it seems like Donald Trump is still trying to rally his supporters around the possibility that he could remain the president for the next 4 years.
Now, he's rallying his supporters this week in Washington, D.C. He says 1 million people are going to come. But mind you, he said there was 1 million at his inauguration. So braggadocio is his middle name. But I think it's likely to be a significant demonstration. What say you?
Well, he certainly has been able to pull off some very effective mobilizations of the public among his supporters. D.C. Has seen some very, very big protests of Trump supporters lately. Now, that said, is he really capable of mobilizing enough support that he could actually stand in the wave of opposition, where even his own party doesn't really seem like they are fully behind keeping him in office? Ted Cruz is sympathetic to Donald Trump and his efforts to stay president, but it seems like beyond a few in the Republican Party and in Congress, he doesn't really have much support for these efforts.
That's the question I was going to ask you later. Let me ask it now. Is this not therefore pregnant with real problems inside the Republican Party? Because it's quite clear to me that Donald Trump is much more popular than the Republican Party, but the Republican Party have largely deserted him in this admittedly rather bizarre last-ditch effort to remain in office. Does that not presage a split of some kind?
Well, it's pretty clear that Donald Trump won't be going away. He may not be president of the United States for very much longer, but he's certainly not going to disappear. His movement of supporters is going to continue to exist, and the anger that they have at the other factions within the Republican Party, at the neoconservative wing, at the more centrist wing of the Republican Party, that is going to remain pretty well intact. And it points to the fact that we are in a crisis in the United States in both parties. In both parties, there seems to be a lot of anger among the rank and file and a lot of efforts to calm things down and defend the status quo at the top. And Donald Trump represents probably what most Republicans think, where most Republicans are sympathetic to Trump and not to the leaders of their party. And the same could be said in the Democratic camp, where Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, and the rising Democratic Socialist opposition, they represent what most Democrats think, while the leadership, Nancy Pelosi and the incoming Biden administration, they represent a centrist current that is kind of out of touch with the average Democratic voter.
So you've got two parties, big tents, but where the people at the top of the tent, up the flagpole, are increasingly unrepresentative of the rest of the people in the tent. Is that a situation that can forever hold?
Well, I mean, it is a situation that is causing lots of tension, and you have to wonder, how long will it hold? Look, Kamala Harris is going to be the vice president of the United States, and Joe Biden is not exactly a young man, so there's a very good chance Kamala Harris could soon be president. But let's remember that less than 1% of Democratic voters voted for her in the Democratic primary, less than 1%. But she could very soon be the next president. That shows a political system that isn't exactly representing the will of the people. And this boiling tension beneath the surface in both parties is spilling over into our streets. Look, 2020 is probably going to be looked back on as a turning point because the amount of political violence we have seen in the United States in the previous year has not been small. When it came to the George Floyd protests, it came to, right-wing demonstrations, it came to what was going on the streets of Oregon. There has been an upsurge of political activism that often turns rather bloody in the streets of the United States of America. This is a situation boiling with tension.
And the economy, of course, is tanking.
Oh, of course. The unemployment rates, the fact that New York City is basically New York City, people describe it as the capital of capitalism. Wall Street is here. The UN is here. This is supposed to be the most prosperous center of the global economy. And you look outside, you see stores that are boarded up and closed down. You see mass unemployment. You see lines of people outside of Catholic charities desperately trying to get some food. You see homeless people, just crowds and crowds of homeless people desperately trying to get by. You see a city that has just been devastated by this pandemic and by the lockdowns. We've seen restaurant workers and restaurant owners protesting and saying that Bill de Blasio, our mayor, is not looking out for them. There's just widespread anger and unemployment and a lot of the rich folks who live here in New York City, right? All those penthouses, all those luxury apartments, a lot of them are empty. The rich folks have packed up and gotten out of town because there's nothing here. You can't go to Broadway. You can't do any of the New York City things. You can't live the lifestyle, the nightlife that New York City is famous for. New York City is just crumbling amid this pandemic. And if New York City is suffering, imagine how things are in parts of the country that haven't always been so prosperous.
And Joe Biden doesn't have a plan for getting out of this, does he?
No. Joe Biden is coming in. His plan consists of making everyone wear a mask for the first 100 days, though he's only able to enforce that on federal. So he's coming in. Everyone's going to have to wear a mask. That's going to be his first agenda item. And other than that, we're not really hearing a clear plan. Now, what is interesting is many people are anticipating a crackdown. Already we've seen the Democratic mayor of Portland, who at first, it seemed like he was all for those protesters. He loved those protesters back over the summer. He was with them. He was against the system. But now you look into what's going on. You listen to what's being said by the leadership in Seattle, in Portland, and other Democratic cities. It looks like that now that Donald Trump will be leaving office, there's a crackdown coming, right? Playtime is over. Protests were great when it was destabilizing things and hurting Donald Trump. But now that Trump is leaving office, the crackdown is coming. They're talking about swiftly cracking down on the growing unrest in the United States. The Democrats may very soon be locking up the protesters they were hugging yesterday.
Well, nobody cracks down like a Democrat cracked down. Those of us who remember the Chicago convention of the Democratic Party in 1968 could testify to that. But that will merely accentuate this division inside the Democratic Party that we talked about earlier. Is nobody setting up a new party, Caleb? Because it seems to me screamingly obvious that a People's Party, I know there is a project for one, but a People's Party is vitally needed now by the people.
Well, certainly. Cornel West, Jimmy Dore, and others have come forward with the People's Party as an alternative to the Democratic Party. That has been put forward. What I think is shocking is just how the comedian Jimmy Dore has called out the Democrats, called out the AOC and others for not fighting for Medicare for all. And there has just been an avalanche of rage and persecution poured on Jimmy Dore by the Democrats. They are just determined to silence him and not let him say what needs to be said, which is that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it's blatantly obvious that healthcare should be a human right. The health of one is the health of all. And if you have a system where everyone's being told you're on your own, your health is your business, you're not going to be able to resolve health issues. In a pandemic, it's blatantly obvious we need Medicare for all in the United States. Jimmy Dore has stepped up and said what is obvious. And the response of the Democratic machine, not just the centrist wing, but even some of the so-called socialist wing of the Democratic machine has just been an avalanche of trying to silence him. But yet he has maintained his position. He has not backed down. And polls are showing that despite being told not to, average Democrats agree with Jimmy Dore. So this tension is boiling over in the Democratic Party. It's boiling over on the streets of the United States. We've got Donald Trump, who may be leaving office, but certainly won't be leaving American politics. This is America in 2021 as we face a new year.
I mean, we are two people divided by a common language, but some of the audience, the British audience at least, will be scratching their head about this. After all, we got Medicare for all, called the National Health Service, in 1945. Yeah? And you are describing a situation where a comedian, a very good one, a radio TV host, a very good one, but not a politician, he demands Medicare for all, and the Democrats come down on him like a ton of bricks. It's very difficult to understand that, Caleb.
Indeed. I mean, we in the United States have been told over and over and over again that if we have what you have over in the United Kingdom, if we adopt a national health service, this will mean full communism. It'll be Stalinism. People will not get health care. They'll be in lines, dying on waiting lists. We have just been told every horror story, and the power of the big pharmaceutical companies and the big health insurance groups and the big money involved in preventing the USA from adopting health care for all. That power is very, very hard to roll back. And even some of the voices that on paper say they advocate it are not comfortable, with Jimmy Dore, a well-loved comedian, coming forward and saying, why don't you fight for it? And that has been his demand. He said, put your money where your mouth is. If you really want Medicare for all, now is the time to come out swinging amid this pandemic. That's all he said, but they simply won't have it. It shows how much, despite public opinion in the United States favoring a shift in the healthcare services, despite all of that, it shows how much the United States is not exactly a pure democracy. There is the rule of big money and big lobby groups. They have a lot of power when it comes to the American political process, no doubt about it.
You're not getting much health for your buck. The U.S. spends more on healthcare than anybody else in the world, and yet the outcomes for scores of millions of people are as you have described them. In the middle of a pandemic, there are people who don't have health insurance.
Oh, it was unbelievable. At the beginning, people who weren't insured were being charged thousands and thousands of dollars for getting a test. They were coming back from their travel. Maybe they were in China. Maybe they were overseas. They came back to the United States, and of course, they did the responsible thing. They got a test to make sure they didn't have it, and then they'd be stuck with a bill of thousands of dollars. This is just completely irrational. This is completely irrational. But it's the rule of the dollar. This is free market economics, neoliberalism, Adam Smith politics and economics in practice, and it was a disaster. And we're living with the aftermath of it here in New York City as the city remains locked down and so many are suffering. Around the country, so many are unemployed. It's quite a nightmare.
Caleb, finally, and I'm grateful for your time. This time next year, who'll be the president? Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or Kamala Harris?
That's a very good question. I think that it's very likely it'll be Kamala Harris, but we shall see. We shall see what happens as events develop and transgress in the coming months.
Caleb Maupin, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Should Boris Johnson announce